She was a beautiful young woman with a heart that was just as radiant.
She wanted to be a model originally, but decided that she wanted to be a nurse.
She had this loving, caring heart.
And when she met someone who shared her same positive outlook on life, sparks flew.
He was confident, fun, and friendly.
When she found out that she was pregnant, she was super excited.
Janelle was a wonderful mother.
But when she goes missing, there's immediate fears of foul play.
Because it's really not like her to go without communicating with someone in the family.
I'm like, man, something's not right, something's not right.
We knew that something had to be wrong.
Police will have to follow a winding trail of breadcrumbs to get to the truth.
She was looking for something new, something fresh to get away from her past.
There's no point of being apart. We might as well just continue to grow and make this a family.
Can they find the missing mother before it's too late?
We found some things that just simply don't add up.
He's got this now. Oh, you think?
They were sworn mortal enemies.
She took things to a whole nother level.
They said, "You're not telling us the full story."
They found blood.
Dear God.
Sweltering summer day in College Park, Georgia, a buzzing community just south of Atlanta.
In the summertime, we're talking hot. I mean, they don't call it Hotlanta by accident.
College Park in July is lively, very lively. It's kind of like almost the end of summer. So it's like that last bit of rush of just wanting to do everything and be outside.
At 10:30 a.m., 22-year-old Aisha Davis is trying to stay cool in the summer heat when she receives an unexpected phone call.
Hey, Errol, what's up?
The call is from Errol Moore, who shares a 5-month-old daughter with Aisha's sister, Janelle Aaron.
He called me and he proceeded to ask me had I spoken to my sister, Janelle. And I told him that no, I hadn't spoken to her.
No, is everything okay?
I'm not sure.
He was worried because he hadn't spoken to her all weekend.
He stated that he called her multiple times on the phone and that she never answered the phone.
I mean, every time I try, I go straight to voicemail.
Let me try to give her a call.
I hung up with him and then I tried to reach her and I couldn't. And that's what began my worry.
Hey, it's Janelle. I can't get to the phone right now. Leave a message.
Hey, Janelle, give me a call when you get this.
Janelle was pretty tight with her extended family. She talked to them often.
Because it's really not like her to go missing without communicating with someone in the family for days.
So once I reached out to our family and friends, we realized that no one was able to get in contact or had spoken to Janelle in over 4 days.
We knew something was wrong.
Despite a challenging upbringing, 20-year-old Janelle Aaron always kept a positive outlook on life.
We grew up in family and foster care and custody of different family members. It was pretty much her and I against the world. But Janelle was very vibrant. She loved to make people laugh. She loved to what we call roast and joke. Her smile, her presence, she let you know she was here.
We met in high school around 10th grade. She was funny, feisty, really nice, kind, loyal, ride or die.
Janelle was also a dreamer with big plans for her future.
She was into fashion, a fashionista, I would say.
She wanted to be a model originally, but as she got older, Janelle decided that she wanted to be a nurse because she loved taking care of people. She had a knack for making people feel comfortable, making people feel safe.
She had this loving, caring heart, and she wanted to give back.
She was seeking a degree in healthcare into nursing to pursue her final career.
It was around that time Janelle met a fellow student, Errol Moore.
Hey, I think I've seen you in class.
Yes, Mr. Gibson's class, right?
Yeah, I'm Errol.
Janelle.
You mind if I sit?
Of course, you can sit down.
He was confident, and Janelle really gravitated towards that.
So, I'm heading out with some friends after classes this afternoon. You wanna come?
Sounds good. Sure.
Errol was fun and friendly, and they had lots in common in terms of their upbringing.
Once they started dating, their relationship moved fast.
The couple immediately became inseparable. If you saw one, you saw the other.
And in July of 2009, they received some unexpected news that would change their lives forever.
Janelle was dating Errol for about a year when she found out that she was pregnant. She was super excited. She always wanted to be a mother.
She had a natural maternal instinct. She loved children.
The way we grew up, not having our mother in our life in the capacity in which we wanted it, we always said that when we had children that, we were going to be amazing moms.
In February of 2010, her baby girl arrived.
She was excited and happy that she was finally born. She was very attentive, very caring and loving.
Janelle was a wonderful mother.
Once she had her daughter, that's all that mattered. There was nothing more important or a bigger accomplishment for her or achievement than bringing her daughter into this world.
Errol also took parenthood in stride.
Errol, as a father, was very invested. He was present. He definitely showed that he loved her and that he was excited that he had a new baby in the world.
But just 5 months after the birth of her daughter, Janelle's family is worried that something terrible has happened to the young mother.
No one has heard from Janelle in about 4 days, and this isn't like her to just disappear.
Janelle would never leave her 5-month-old daughter behind and just abandon her.
We decided to reach out to the police and put in a missing persons report.
In the summer of 2010, Janelle Aaron was making strides to fulfill her dream of working in healthcare.
She entered Georgia Perimeter College, working to be a nurse.
She and her boyfriend, Errol Moore, had just welcomed a baby girl the same year. They had a bright future ahead of them.
But on July 19th, Janelle has gone missing.
No one has heard from Janelle in about 4 days.
We decided to reach out to the police and put in a missing persons report. When we spoke to detectives, we tried to drive into them how we knew that something had to be wrong. Janelle had never been away from her daughter for any long extended amount of time, not even more than 24 hours, let alone multiple days.
What's so tricky for law enforcement is to try to understand, is this the type of lady who would go missing? Is this the type of lady who was exhausted from, those early months? What do we have here? Do we actually have a missing person?
So we understand Janelle's a new mom, so you don't think she might have just been trying to get away for a little while?
Absolutely not. She loves her daughter.
The family reiterated that Janelle would never leave her 5-month-old daughter behind and just abandon her.
She loved that baby girl.
Where's Janelle's daughter now?
She's at the house with her father.
Did Janelle seem stressed or upset about anything in the days leading up to her disappearance?
Yeah, she's been in a funk lately.
Janelle had been struggling with some postpartum depression.
Janelle dealt with what a lot of women deal with financially, being able to support your child as well as be present at the same time, which, of course, is hard to deal with for anyone.
But that's not all the young mother had been struggling with recently.
Janelle had hit a rough patch with Errol.
Janelle and Errol's relationship was very on again, off again.
And right now they're off. And she's actually seeing somebody new.
Oh, and who's that?
The family told police about this new guy, Tim Williams. This is somebody that Janelle had started dating.
They were in a new relationship, and she talked about him all the time. She was excited about this new relationship and where it could go.
Y'all spoken with this Tim fellow to see if maybe Janelle's with him?
No, we don't have his contact information.
Ladies, thank you for coming in.
However, detectives quickly tracked Tim down.
After a quick background check, police find out that this Tim Williams worked at a shoe store.
He is a student at Georgia State. He has no criminal background.
Detectives reach out to Tim and ask him to come in for an interview regarding Janelle's disappearance.
I got a phone call from a detective. A detective wanted to see me personally to ask me questions about her whereabouts. And I remember just being shook up.
He's being very compliant and amicable, so he goes into the station for an interview.
Tim, thanks for coming in today.
Of course. Anything I can do to help?
I remember going to the police station and talking to the detectives and just feeling sick.
Now, we're gonna have to ask you some tough questions, okay, Tim?
I'm understanding they have to do their job, but just them asking me certain questions as if like I would know what her whereabouts was, as if I would ever injure anybody but her in particular. How much did I love her? Did I provoke anybody in her circle? Or do I have anybody that's after me that would harm her just to get back at me?
This is all so crazy. I have no idea where she is.
I remember just kind of taking it all in and hitting them with a lot of no sir, yes sir, no sir, yes sir. This is all kind of too much.
I just hope that she's okay. She really means a lot to me.
We just had a spark for each other, like a spark. Like I was really intrigued at how driven she was. Janelle's personality was everything all in once. Like she was so outgoing and bubbly, but she was also a firecracker. And when she loved you, she loved you.
She is just the best mom.
At that time, I didn't have any kids, but I looked at her daughter as mine. Like it wasn't no turning her away from me.
Janelle indicated that she was looking for something new, something fresh to get away from her past. It made Tim believe that whatever she had with Errol is past tense and that he was going to be the man for her moving forward.
Well, when's the last time you've seen Janelle?
Tim says that the last time he talked to Janelle was the morning of July 15th because she had spent the night with him.
What you cooking?
The last time I spoke and saw Janelle, I have this day in my head. It runs back and back and back. And I just remember her making grits, eggs, and biscuits for me.
I have it right here for you, honey.
Oh, son. This looks delicious. Thank you, baby.
You're welcome.
Timothy explains that Janelle and her daughter had been planning to move in with him.
Part of the day's plan was for her to gather up her things and come move into the apartment with me. It was to the point where it was like, there's no point in us being apart. We might as well just like continue to grow and make this a family. And like, this is gonna be your new life.
Well, I gotta get over there.
I remember she gave me a hug, I kissed her.
I love you so much.
Love you too.
She left and she told me she would give me a call later on that day to let me know when she was on her way back.
However, Tim says he never got that call.
Waited for hours and I heard nothing back.
I got honestly concerned, so I called the phone. She didn't pick up.
Later on that evening, Tim finally got a response, but it only raised more cause for concern.
I got a text message back that said, "Who is this?" So I knew that was a concerning point. I was like, I need to go over to this crib that she said she was going to. It was a place that she was sharing with her old ex-boyfriend. I need to go see, make sure everything is okay.
But when Tim went over to the apartment, he didn't find Janelle, her daughter, or Errol.
No one was home as far as I could tell.
Went out there with some childhood friends of mine, and we knocked on the door. We banged on the door because I just had to know she was okay. Nobody ever answered. Tried to peek through the window, didn't see anything.
Well, how does Errol feel about Janelle moving in with you?
Not good. Jealous?
There definitely seemed to be some jealousy issues there. I think Errol viewed the situation as if Tim was trying to take over his family.
But Tim claims Janelle had good reason to leave.
Tim told detectives that he heard Errol had been violent with Janelle in the past.
She didn't tell me a lot of details, but that's part of the reason that she didn't want to be with him anymore.
This information raises red flags for detectives.
If Errol had been violent with Janelle in the past, was it possible that he took things too far?
But before detectives can reach out to Errol, they receive an alarming phone call that will turn the case on its head.
Police get this call from the apartment manager where Janelle lived.
The property manager said, I think y'all want to be aware of this.
They found blood.
In July of 2010, detectives have spoken with Timothy Williams about the disappearance of his girlfriend, 20-year-old Janelle Aaron.
In speaking with Timothy, detectives learned that Janelle was planning to move out of her apartment with her ex, Errol Moore, and start a new life with him.
But that new life never came to fruition.
Timothy claims that after Janelle left his apartment the morning of the 14th to gather her things, he never heard from her again.
And now, detectives have received an alarming phone call from Janelle's apartment complex.
Police get this call from the apartment manager. They had been preparing to lease out her apartment. They had cleaned it out and everything.
And the property manager said, I think y'all want to be aware of this.
They found blood underneath the carpet in the apartment.
Thank you for your time, Tim.
Is everything okay?
We'll be in touch. Walk you out.
The discovery was made during a routine carpet cleaning.
As the carpet cleaner is, of course, cleaning the carpet, the machinery he uses is applying steam to that area, and as that steam hits, blood starts to come up.
Detectives head to the apartment to view the shocking new blood evidence for themselves.
The padding that was underneath the original carpet was soaked completely in blood, and the wooden subfloor directly underneath that was also soaked completely in blood.
Whoever was at that spot where that stain was starting was bleeding a lot.
And that became the very first sign, beyond their hunch, that we had wrongdoing here, that there was some foul play.
Now more than ever, detectives are eager to speak with Errol Moore. And later that afternoon, they're able to do just that.
He's very cooperative and agrees to go to the station for an interview. He seems very concerned about the blood found at the apartment.
But Errol insists he has no idea how it got there.
Do y'all think that means she's hurt? I'm so worried about her.
We don't know. We've sent the blood off for testing to see if it's a match for Janelle, but it's not looking good.
Detectives tell him that they know he's been physically violent with Janelle in the past. And Errol doesn't deny it. He says, yes, he has, but they always found a way to smooth things out and make up.
It's definitely not something that I'm proud of. I care about her a lot.
Errol says the last time he saw Janelle was on the 15th, when she was packing up her bags at her apartment.
And then later on, he had no idea where Janelle was at and was unable to get in contact with her. He stated that he called her multiple times on the phone and that she never answered the phone.
Errol admits he wasn't happy about Janelle's plan to move in with her new boyfriend, Tim.
He knew about Tim, he knew that Tim was dating Janelle, but he assures detectives that it was nothing serious.
Listen, Janelle and I have never had the perfect relationship, but we always end up working things out.
He said Janelle was still in love with him and that they were planning on getting back together.
Errol claims that he and Janelle had so much chemistry that in fact, the two of them had sex multiple times on the 15th.
What time did she leave?
Well, technically, I'm the one who left.
What do you mean?
Errol Moore mentions that he has another girlfriend.
He says he took the baby to his other girlfriend's house.
Errol's new girlfriend's name is Candace Dean.
So the police are like, well, who is Candace Dean?
Errol told police that he and Candace had dated in high school, then she moved away for about a year, but when she returned, they picked up where they left off.
Janelle wasn't too happy about that, and she started sending Candace messages on social media.
Candace and Janelle were sworn mortal enemies.
Oh, girl, get out of here. He's got this now.
College Park detectives investigating the disappearance of 20-year-old Janelle Aaron are speaking with her ex-boyfriend, Errol Moore.
Errol claims that he and Janelle slept together on July 15th, the same day she disappeared.
And according to Errol, that wasn't his only sexual rendezvous that day.
When he left the apartment, he left to meet up with his girlfriend, Candace Dean.
Candace and Janelle were sworn mortal enemies.
Errol tells detectives the tension between Janelle and Candace reached its peak a few months earlier.
Errol claimed Janelle actually confronted him and Candace.
Oh, girl, get out of here. He's got this now. You think so?
Janelle, just leave us alone.
Errol says he's trying to get Janelle to leave, and then that's when he says Janelle took things to a whole nother level.
Janelle actually escalated it and slapped Errol across the face.
Errol claims he tried to keep his cool.
Errol just told her she needed to leave and she needed to calm down.
Errol said she finally left, but she and Candace never smoothed things over.
Do you think Candace could have harmed Janelle?
Nah, no way.
Errol told police that he knew that Candace hated Janelle and Janelle hated Candace, but he didn't think that she would want to hurt her.
However, detectives aren't so sure.
They want to speak with Candace immediately to get her side of the story.
So after wrapping up their interview with Errol, they bring Candace in for questioning.
So here's the deal, Candace. Janelle Aaron has been missing since July 15th, and we know the two of you have not been getting along.
So, I haven't seen her in months, and I plan to keep it that way.
Candace says that Errol was only spending time with Janelle because of the baby, and that Errol really didn't want to be with her, and he was truly in love with Candace.
Is that why he slept with her on the 15th before he met up with you?
What?
This information hits Candace hard. She starts crying. She's very emotional.
I can't believe he played me like that.
Candace, listen. Tell us the truth. Did you do anything to hurt Janelle?
No.
Candace admitted that she and Janelle hated each other, but she didn't have anything to do with her disappearance.
Candace confirms that Errol came over to her place on the evening of July 15th, around 7:30 p.m.
She said he went to spend the night with her and left the next day around noon. She never saw or heard from Janelle during that time.
Detectives are suspicious of Candace's story, but they can't hold her on a hunch.
While detectives aren't 100% sure that they can trust Candace, they have no evidence to hold her on, so they end up releasing her.
Without a body or confirmation of Janelle being dead, the police have their hands tied in a lot of ways.
However, when the lab results from the blood found in Janelle's apartment come back, it confirms everyone's worst fears.
The crime lab confirmed, in fact, that the blood within the apartment belonged to Janelle Aaron. We had positive identification at that point that that blood was hers.
At this point, detectives are worried it may be too late to save Janelle. It's clear she lost a lot of blood.
But who did this to her? When Janelle's best friend, Jasmine Clark, comes forward, detectives will get one step closer to answering that question.
Thank you for coming in today. We understand that you may have some information that will be useful to us.
The last time I talked to Janelle was July 15th. On the phone, Janelle was telling me about Tim, and she sounded really excited about this relationship. I remember asking her, well, what about Errol? And she seemed so done. Like, okay, what about him? She was so over it.
Girl, I'm packing up to leave as we speak.
But Jasmine says Errol soon interrupted their conversation.
Janelle! They started arguing, like a verbal altercation, and she was like, basically like, I'm gonna call you back. Basically, when he leaves, I'll call you back. And I said, okay.
Bye, girl.
Factually, Errol was the last person to be with Janelle.
The detectives asked me if I believed that Errol was capable of hurting Janelle, and yes, I did believe that.
Detectives need to get Errol Moore to tell them the truth.
After speaking with her best friend Jasmine, detectives investigating the disappearance of Janelle Aaron are more certain than ever that Janelle's ex-boyfriend, Errol Moore, knows what happened to her.
Janelle's best friend Jasmine overheard her arguing over the phone with Errol shortly before she disappeared.
And according to Janelle's friends, he was known to be violent with her.
The detectives asked me if I believed that Errol was capable of hurting Janelle, and yes, I did believe that.
So based on those facts and circumstances, we knew that it was highly likely that he had a direct involvement with Janelle's disappearance, but we had no proof. We had no eyewitnesses.
Detectives know that if they want any chance of finding Janelle alive, they're going to have to get Errol to come out with the truth.
Later that day, they bring him back in for a follow-up interview.
Welcome back, Errol.
They said, you know, Errol, you're not telling us the full story. We've done our own investigation, and we found some things that just simply don't add up.
What were you and Janelle arguing about that afternoon, and why did you fail to mention it the last time we spoke?
At this point, Errol cracks.
So what Errol Moore finally said was, you know what, it's true. What I'd been telling you wasn't the full story. Errol said, I got in an argument with her about Tim Williams.
Now, what does he have that I don't?
He's nice to me for one thing.
And I'm not nice to you?
Janelle fought back. She argued with him that he was with Candace. He was with somebody else too, so why did it matter if she had moved on?
Just leave me alone.
What? Nah.
Errol admits that the argument became more and more heated.
Errol claims Janelle then escalated the fight to a whole new level.
You're making a mistake. We should be a family.
Errol, I've had it with you.
At that point, Janelle, he says, grabbed a knife.
Errol says he grabbed Janelle's hand and that's when she dropped the knife, but he says she kept coming at him and he says that's when he put her in a chokehold.
And then just began choking her, and she began convulsing. After her convulsion, she fell down on the ground, and he said he could not get her up.
Janelle?
Well, what about the blood?
I asked him, did you cut her? Because there was a lot of blood in the house. And he said no, but she was bleeding out the mouth.
Errol said, I panicked and I left with the baby and I left with her things.
Look, I was just so in shock that the situation got so out of hand.
I said, well, where did you go? And he said, well, I went back to my girlfriend's house and I continued my life, basically.
I was confused. I was scared.
He said, I spent the weekend trying to figure out what to do.
And Errol said when a couple days went by, he knew he needed to do something.
As time passed, he was able to gather his thoughts, and then he realized that he had to go back and clean up the crime scene.
At first, he was hoping it was just a horrible nightmare. But when he opened the door, he saw Janelle lying in a pool of her own blood.
Errol didn't really know what to do with the body, but eventually he looked around and he saw a big blue bin that Janelle had used to move her things down to Atlanta. He grabbed the bin and placed her body in the bin.
Then he began cleaning up.
And what'd you do with her body?
Tell us where she is, Errol.
He finally admits that he placed her in a wooded area near Sherwood Cemetery.
Well, you have to believe me, I didn't expect for any of this to happen.
Go ahead and stand up, Errol.
With Errol's confession, Clayton County Police arrest him, and they assemble a team to go out and recover Janelle's body.
We went out to Sherwood Cemetery and started doing a grid search.
Eventually, they see something in the distance there. It looks like something covered in leaves, and they walk up and discover a blue bin.
What's inside that bin is the likes of which investigators have never seen.
Dear God.
In October of 2010, Errol Moore has finally admitted to killing his ex-girlfriend, Janelle Aaron.
He claimed he killed her in self-defense after she came at him with a knife, but investigators don't really buy his story.
After speaking with Errol, investigators have arrived at the location where he claims to have left Janelle's body inside a plastic bin, but they never could have prepared themselves for what they find.
What's inside that bin is the likes of which investigators have never seen.
Dear God.
The badly decomposed remains of Janelle Aaron.
Her body literally melted in that hot Atlanta heat.
Atlanta had a large amount of rain during the summertime. And unfortunately, with that large amount of rain, the actual plastic tote that her body was placed in filled up with water all the way to the top. There wasn't a lot left of her body.
The state of decomposition means proving cause of death will be difficult.
We could never figure out what actually cause of death was because there was no physical evidence to say that she was stabbed, choked, because the body was so decomposed.
The news hits Janelle's loved ones like a ton of bricks.
They've informed us that they have found my sister's remains and that Errol led them to her. My first reaction, I screamed. I just screamed.
I remember they telling me that she was deceased. And I remember just dropping down to my knees and crying. I remember like being around people and they like, what is wrong with him? Like, it just broke my heart.
I was heartbroken. I was destroyed. I couldn't understand how Errol was the one saying, come home, and this whole time it was you.
We had been suffering and searching and hoping and wanting and processing and dealing for over 3 months at this point. So the relief came in getting that information that we needed so that we could be at peace. There was minor relief in knowing that he was caught and that he wasn't going to be able to just live out here freely.
Errol is officially charged with Janelle's murder.
He was charged with 1 count of malice murder, 1 count of felony murder, 3 counts of concealing a body, and 1 count of tampering with evidence.
And when he goes on trial in April of 2012, prosecutors don't hold back.
One of the main thrusts of this case for the prosecution was the hypocrisy of it all. The hypocrisy of his actions and the hypocrisy of his words. That is, after she went missing in July, he spent the next 2 or 3 months talking about how much he missed her, talking about how much their baby needed her mother, and then to have it discovered that he knew where her remains were the entire time. And for months he knew, and for months he did nothing about it, while callously disregarding the pain and the suffering that her family was going through. And so that was the story we told.
Errol's defense team echoes the same version of events Errol told detectives, that he attacked Janelle in self-defense. But prosecutors aren't buying it.
Our theory of the case from beginning to end always was and still remains that this wasn't an act of self-defense. This was an act of rage.
Now, what does he have that I don't?
Just leave me alone.
What? Nah.
Janelle never came at Errol with a knife. She was simply trying to leave the apartment.
You ain't leaving.
Okay, can you stop?
I ain't letting you break up our family.
It's surmised that when she tried to leave, Errol slammed her to the ground, with the force of impact causing her to bleed out, resulting in the pool of blood found in the apartment.
This was an act of enraged young man responding to a situation that he could no longer control, and that is namely Janelle moving on and seeing a new guy and starting a new life. He has this personality type of narcissism. I'm gonna be the one to control this. I'm gonna be the one to prevail. And so it's that very personality type that led to the murder in the first place.
But after the jury retires to deliberate, they send shockwaves through the courtroom.
Some of the jury believes that Errol was telling the truth.
You have 12 jurors. You have to have an unanimous verdict. It has to be all 12. When they show what happened, they make a decision, guilty or not.
They can't reach a decision. So ultimately, the court is left to declare a mistrial.
I was extremely nervous when the mistrial happened and that he may get away with it. I was very worried. And he had been twisting the story and maneuvering it the entire time. So there's always that in the back of your mind, like they could possibly believe that. And he could possibly get away with it.
Errol Moore used the self-defense issue, which shows you even more that he really had no remorse for Janelle. If he did, he would take responsibility for it and not put the family through that trial again.
To go through a trial is just grueling in itself. To go through that process, especially with someone who you love and you're close with, but then to watch and hear a mistrial and to just feel like that person is getting away, even if it's just momentarily, that feeling of helplessness, that feeling of that person possibly getting away with taking your loved one from you and there's nothing you can do about it. I don't wish that feeling on anyone.
But prosecutors encourage Janelle's loved ones to keep the faith.
He doesn't get released on bond or nothing like that. They just try it again. To have a verdict, you have to have all 12 people make the same decision on it. It can't be a majority.
So in April 2012, the second trial began. And honestly, I will say I didn't want to get my hopes up. I was hoping that this time around, justice would be served and we would get some progress, but didn't have my hopes up high for it.
This time, the district attorney's office presented basically the same evidence as last time, trying to show that this was not an accident. This was premeditated jealousy.
And this time, the jury agrees.
The jury in Clayton County found Errol Moore guilty of voluntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, aggravated assault.
Voluntary manslaughter, meaning that Errol Moore did kill Janelle Aaron, but it was in a heat of passion. It wasn't a malice, intentional murder.
Clayton County judge sentenced Errol Moore to 36 years behind bars, which seems like not enough time in this case.
I was relieved when I heard the verdict to an extent, but unfortunately, my sister's life is over. She'll never get to know her daughter. My family and I will never get to speak to her again. We'll never get to see her again. It'll never be fair. It'll never be completely justified, in my opinion.
Eventually, he will be out. Hopefully, he matured and he forgave himself for his wrongs, and the world will too. But me personally, I never forgive him. A beautiful soul was taken away off jealousy and anger. We lost a great woman, a great mother, a great friend, a soulmate, a sister in this horrible.
The night air in suburban Melbourne carried a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had chosen to hold its breath. It was the kind of quiet that only exists in places where people believe they are safe. Neatly trimmed hedges, softly glowing porch lights, the distant hum of a television behind closed curtains, everything about these streets whispered routine, comfort, predictability. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something else moved. Something patient. Something that had already chosen its next door. Inside the house, the clock ticked with quiet insistence, each second dissolving into the next. A child slept in her bedroom, her breathing steady, her dreams untouched by fear. Down the hall, her parents rested, unaware that the fragile boundary between their world and the darkness outside had already been crossed. There were no barking dogs. No shattered glass. No sudden noise to announce intrusion. Only the soft, almost respectful presence of someone who had done this before. He did not rush. He never rushed. The door had been studied long before this night. The windows observed, the routines memorized. He knew which lights were left on, which ones went dark first, and how long it took for the house to settle into silence. He knew when the neighborhood would be at its most defenseless, not because it was asleep, but because it believed nothing could happen here. A shadow moved through the hallway, controlled and precise. There was no hesitation in his steps, no uncertainty. He carried with him the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly how much fear weighed, and how to use it without ever raising his voice. When he entered the parents' room, it was not chaos that followed, but command. A whisper. A threat delivered not with anger, but with certainty. By the time the family understood what was happening, it was already too late to resist. Their movements slowed by terror, their thoughts fragmented by the realization that this was not a burglary, not a random act. This was something else entirely. Something targeted. Something planned. He spoke calmly, almost politely, as if guiding them through a routine he had rehearsed countless times. The weapon in his hand did not need to be used. Its presence was enough. It always was. He instructed them where to lie, how to stay still, what would happen if they disobeyed. There was no shouting, no panic in his voice. Just quiet control. Then he turned his attention to the child. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching into something unfamiliar. Every step toward her room felt heavier, as if the house itself were resisting, as if the walls understood what was about to unfold. But nothing stopped him. Nothing ever did. He opened the door slowly. Inside, the world was still soft, still innocent. A nightlight cast a gentle glow across the room, illuminating toys left exactly where they had been dropped earlier that evening. A book lay open on the bedside table, its story paused mid-sentence. The child stirred slightly, sensing something without fully waking, hovering in that fragile space between sleep and awareness. And then she saw him. Not clearly. Not completely. Just enough to understand that something was wrong. He approached her with the same unsettling calm, his face concealed, his hands gloved, every detail designed to erase identity while amplifying fear. He spoke to her in the same measured tone, instructing, reassuring, controlling. It was a voice that did not need to be loud to be obeyed. In that moment, the entire world of that house collapsed into a single truth. This man had come for her. Not the valuables. Not the parents. Her. Outside, the street remained silent. A car passed in the distance, its headlights briefly sweeping across the closed curtains before disappearing into the night. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then fell quiet again. Life continued, undisturbed, unaware that within one ordinary home, something irreversible was unfolding. Time moved differently inside that house. Minutes stretched into something unrecognizable, each second marked not by the ticking of the clock, but by the slow, methodical actions of a man who seemed entirely at ease. There was no urgency in him, no sign of doubt. Only purpose. When he finally left, he did so as quietly as he had arrived. No alarms. No witnesses. No clear trace. Just absence. The kind of absence that echoes louder than any scream. By the time the house found its voice again, by the time the parents managed to break free, to reach for the phone, to call for help, the night had already swallowed him. He was gone, dissolving back into the same darkness he had emerged from, leaving behind questions that would haunt not just one family, but an entire city. Because this was not the beginning. And it would not be the end. In the years that followed, the name would emerge from whispered conversations and newspaper headlines, a name that carried with it a chilling contradiction. A name that sounded almost absurd until you understood what it represented. Mr. Cruel. He was not a ghost, though he moved like one. Not a myth, though people would come to speak of him as if he were something beyond human. He was real. Terrifyingly real. A man who could enter a home without a sound, take what he wanted, and vanish without leaving behind anything solid enough to hold on to. No fingerprints. No clear description. No pattern that could be easily predicted, only one that could be recognized too late. He chose his victims carefully, watching, waiting, learning. He understood fear in a way that went beyond instinct, turning it into a tool, a weapon more effective than anything he carried in his hand. He knew how to control a room, how to silence resistance, how to make people obey without ever needing to raise his voice. And perhaps most unsettling of all, he knew how to disappear. To step out of one life and back into another, seamlessly, invisibly. To walk past neighbors the next day, to exist in plain sight while carrying the weight of what he had done as if it were nothing at all. There are crimes that shock. There are crimes that horrify. And then there are crimes that linger, embedding themselves into the collective memory of a place, reshaping the way people think about safety, about trust, about the thin line between ordinary life and unimaginable violation. This was one of those stories. A story not just about what happened inside those homes, but about what remained afterward. The fear that seeped into quiet neighborhoods. The way parents began to double-check locks, to listen more closely to the sounds of the night, to question the illusion of safety they had once taken for granted. Because once you know someone like him exists, the darkness is never quite the same again. And somewhere, out there in that darkness, he was still watching. In the late 1980s, the eastern and northern suburbs of Melbourne were the kind of places people chose when they wanted distance from the noise of the city without giving up its comforts. Streets were lined with modest brick homes, each one sitting behind a patch of lawn that spoke quietly of routine weekend mowing, children playing after school, neighbors exchanging small talk over low fences. It was not wealth that defined these neighborhoods, but stability. A sense that life here followed an order, predictable and safe, insulated from the chaos that seemed to belong to somewhere else. Families settled into rhythms that rarely changed. Mornings began with the clatter of dishes and the rush to get children ready for school. Afternoons softened into the hum of televisions and the smell of dinner drifting from kitchen windows. Nights were the most peaceful of all. By 10 or 11, most houses had gone dark, curtains drawn, doors locked with a casual confidence that those locks were enough. The idea that someone might cross that threshold uninvited, not just to steal but to take control, felt distant. Almost impossible. It was a time before constant surveillance, before security cameras blinked from every corner and digital alarms connected homes to unseen networks. Protection was physical and simple: a sturdy door, a locked window, a dog in the backyard. And for the most part, that was enough. Crime existed, of course, but it followed patterns people believed they understood. Break-ins happened when houses were empty. Violence belonged to certain areas, certain situations, certain kinds of people. It did not belong here, in these quiet streets where children rode their bikes until dusk and parents trusted the night to remain uneventful. But beneath that sense of order, there were small vulnerabilities, invisible at first glance. The predictability that made life comfortable also made it observable. Lights switched off at the same time each evening. Curtains opened and closed in familiar sequences. Cars left driveways at regular hours. The routines that reassured the people living inside these homes also created a map for anyone patient enough to watch. And someone was watching. Not in a way that drew attention. Not with the recklessness of someone acting on impulse. This was observation shaped by discipline, by a need to understand not just the layout of a house, but the rhythm of the lives within it. Which room belonged to the parents? Which window led to a child's bedroom? How long it took for a family to settle into sleep, when the last light would go out, when the neighborhood would fall into its deepest silence. The suburbs themselves seemed to assist in this quiet surveillance. Wide streets with minimal traffic at night, offering long, uninterrupted views. Houses spaced just far enough apart that small movements could go unnoticed. Backyards that opened into one another, creating pathways that did not appear on any official map. It was a landscape designed for comfort, but also one that, in the wrong hands, could be navigated with unsettling ease. Within these homes lived the families who would become part of a story none of them could have imagined. They were not extraordinary in the way headlines often demand. They were ordinary in the most meaningful sense. Parents who worked steady jobs, who saved for the future, who believed that by choosing a good neighborhood, they had made the right decision for their children. And the children themselves, existing in that brief, fragile space between dependence and independence, old enough to have their own rooms, their own routines, their own sense of the world, but still trusting that the walls around them would keep them safe. It is easy, in hindsight, to look for signs, for moments where something felt off, where a shadow lingered too long or a stranger's gaze lasted a second more than it should have. But at the time, there was nothing that stood out. No obvious warning. No clear indication that these streets, these homes, had already been chosen. The first incident, when it came, did not immediately shatter that illusion of safety. It was disturbing, yes, deeply so, but it could still be contained within a narrative people understood. An intruder, a terrible act, a family targeted for reasons unknown. It was something to be feared, but also something that could be explained away as isolated. An exception, not a pattern. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves slowly. Another incident followed, then another. Each one carrying similarities that were difficult to ignore, yet still elusive enough to prevent immediate clarity. The same quiet entry in the night. The same methodical control. The same unsettling calm described by those who survived. It was not just what was happening, but how it was happening that began to unsettle people. There was no chaos in these crimes. No frenzy. No mistakes that could be easily traced back to a single identity. Instead, there was precision. A sense that every movement had been considered in advance, that every risk had been measured and accounted for. It was this, more than anything, that began to erode the sense of security that had once defined these neighborhoods. Because randomness could be rationalized. But control, this level of control, suggested something far more dangerous. Conversations began to change. What had once been casual discussions about weather or work shifted into quieter, more cautious exchanges. Parents started to ask questions they had never considered before. Were the doors locked? Had anyone noticed anything unusual? Was it safe to leave a window slightly open on a warm night? The media, too, began to take notice, though at first, the information was fragmented. Details were limited, carefully managed by authorities who understood the risk of public panic. But even in those early reports, there was a tone that felt different. A recognition that this was not a typical series of crimes. That something about the offender, about his methods, set him apart in a way that made him difficult to categorize. As more information emerged, so did a name. Not a real one, not an identity that could be traced, but a label that attempted to capture the essence of what people were dealing with. Mr. Cruel. It was a name that felt almost too simple, almost inadequate, yet it carried a weight that grew with each passing incident. It suggested not just violence, but a deliberate, calculated cruelty. The kind that does not erupt in anger, but unfolds with intention. The suburbs began to feel different at night. The same streets, the same houses, but altered by the knowledge that someone had moved through them unseen. Lights stayed on longer. Locks were checked twice, sometimes 3 times. The silence that had once been comforting now carried a different quality, one that made people listen more closely, straining to distinguish between ordinary sounds and something that did not belong. And still, there were no answers. The authorities worked behind the scenes, piecing together what little they had, trying to identify patterns, to predict where he might strike next. But the very thing that made these neighborhoods appealing, their uniformity, their predictability, also made the investigation more complex. There were too many possibilities, too many homes that fit the same profile, too many families living similar lives. Somewhere within that landscape, he existed. Not as an outsider, not as someone who stood apart, but as someone who could blend in, who could observe without being observed. A presence that did not disrupt the surface of daily life, but moved beneath it, quietly, patiently, waiting. The setting of this story is not defined by a single location, but by a feeling. The feeling of safety slowly giving way to uncertainty, of ordinary places becoming the backdrop for something deeply unsettling. It is a reminder that danger does not always announce itself with noise or chaos. Sometimes, it arrives in silence, studies its surroundings, and waits for the perfect moment to step inside. And when it does, everything changes. In stories like this, the victims are often reduced to fragments, to brief mentions in timelines, to names that appear and disappear between the movements of an unseen offender. But before any of that, before fear reshaped their lives and etched their names into police files, they were simply children living within the quiet rhythms of suburban life in Melbourne. Their worlds were small in the way childhood worlds are meant to be, contained within schoolyards, bedrooms filled with scattered toys, and the familiar routes between home and places that felt safe. They woke up to ordinary mornings, the kind that blur together over time. School uniforms laid out the night before, slightly wrinkled. Breakfast half finished as they rushed to gather their bags. The soft insistence of parents reminding them not to forget homework, to be careful, to come straight home. These were not lives marked by danger. They were shaped by routine, by the quiet belief that tomorrow would look much like today. Each of the girls who would later be linked to the name Mr. Cruel had her own personality, her own small details that made her distinct. One might have been the kind of child who lingered over books, getting lost in stories long after bedtime. Another might have preferred the outdoors, the feeling of grass under her feet, the freedom of riding a bike through the neighborhood until the streetlights flickered on. They had favorite songs, favorite foods, small fears, and small dreams. Things that mattered deeply to them, even if the world outside barely noticed. To their families, however, they were everything. Parents saw not just who their daughters were, but who they were becoming. There was pride in small achievements, in good grades, in moments of kindness that hinted at the adults they might one day grow into. There was also a quiet protectiveness, an understanding that childhood was fleeting and fragile, something to be guarded carefully. That protectiveness expressed itself in simple ways, checking in on them before bed, making sure doors were locked, believing that these small acts were enough. One of the girls, Sharon Wills, lived a life that, on the surface, seemed no different from countless others around her. She had friends, routines, a sense of normalcy that came from growing up in a place where nothing truly unexpected was supposed to happen. There were school days filled with lessons that felt important in the moment and trivial in hindsight, evenings spent at home, weekends that unfolded without urgency. Her world was structured, predictable, safe. Another, Carmine Chan, carried her own set of dreams and expectations. She was part of a family that had worked hard to build a life in Australia, a life defined by effort and hope. Her days were shaped by school, by friendships, by the subtle pressures and possibilities that come with being a young teenager. There was a future ahead of her, one that had not yet taken shape but felt full of potential. What connects these girls is not just what happened to them, but the contrast between who they were and what they were forced to endure. They were not chosen because of anything they had done, nor because of any connection to the man who would later be known as Mr. Cruel. They were chosen because they fit a pattern that existed only in his mind. Their age, their environment, the routines of their households, these became criteria in a selection process that was as calculated as it was incomprehensible. There is a particular cruelty in crimes that target children, not only because of the harm inflicted, but because of the trust that is broken. Children exist in a world where safety is assumed, where adults are expected to provide protection, where the boundaries between danger and security are clearly defined. When those boundaries are crossed, the impact reaches far beyond the immediate moment. It reshapes the way they see everything. For the families, the shift is immediate and irreversible. The house that once felt like a sanctuary becomes a place marked by memory, by the knowledge that something terrible has already happened within its walls. Ordinary objects take on new meanings. A bedroom door is no longer just a door. A window is no longer just a window. Each one becomes a point of vulnerability, a reminder of how easily safety can be undone. In the aftermath, there are questions that do not have easy answers. Why this child? Why this house? Why at this moment? These questions echo through conversations, through sleepless nights, through the long process of trying to make sense of something that resists understanding. And while investigators search for patterns, for clues that might lead them to the person responsible, families are left to navigate a different kind of investigation, one that exists entirely within their own memories, replaying events. Searching for anything that might have signaled what was to come. For the survivors, the experience becomes a dividing line, separating life into a before and an after. Before, there was innocence, a sense of the world as something largely predictable. After, there is an awareness that danger can be deliberate, that it can enter quietly and without warning. The details of what they endured are often too heavy to fully articulate, yet they remain present, shaping the way they move through the world, the way they trust, the way they remember. And then there are those who do not get the chance to tell their story in full. The name Carmine Chan carries with it a different weight, one that speaks not only of what was lost, but of what could have been. Her life, like the others, was filled with ordinary moments that now feel impossibly distant. Moments that, in retrospect, take on a kind of quiet significance: the last normal day, the last conversation, the last time everything felt as it should. When people speak of victims in cases like this, there is often a tendency to focus on the crime itself, to center the narrative around the actions of the perpetrator. But the true story lies in the lives that were interrupted, in the futures that were altered or taken away. It is in the details that seem small but are, in fact, everything. The way a child laughed, the things she cared about, the relationships that defined her world. These are the things that matter. Because without them, the story becomes incomplete, reduced to a sequence of events rather than a reflection of real lives affected in profound ways. In the quiet suburbs of Melbourne, where routines once provided comfort, these stories linger. Not always spoken aloud, not always visible, but present in the way people remember, in the way they continue to seek answers. The victims are not just part of a case file, not just names associated with an unsolved mystery. They are the center of it. The reason the story is told, the reason it continues to matter. And as the investigation unfolds, as the search for the man behind these crimes intensifies, it is their stories that remain constant, anchoring the narrative in something real, something human. A reminder that behind every detail, every clue, every theory, there are lives that deserve to be remembered not for what was done to them, but for who they were before it happened. It always began the same way, with a night that felt indistinguishable from any other. The kind of night where nothing seemed out of place, where the air settled gently over quiet streets and the routines of family life folded into sleep without resistance. Inside these homes, there was no sense of anticipation, no awareness that something had already shifted beyond the edges of what could be seen. The windows were closed or left slightly ajar for comfort, doors locked with the quiet confidence that such simple measures were enough. And for years, they had been. But on these nights, there was a difference that no one could feel until it was too late. Somewhere in the darkness, a man was already in motion. He did not arrive by accident, nor did he choose his moment on impulse. Each approach was the result of careful observation, of time spent learning the habits of a household until they became as familiar to him as his own. He knew when the last light would go out, when the television would fall silent, when the house would reach that delicate state between wakefulness and sleep. He waited for that moment with patience that bordered on ritual. Then he moved. There was no dramatic entry, no sudden crash to announce his presence. Doors were opened with precision, windows manipulated without sound. It was as if he slipped through the boundaries of the home rather than breaking them. By the time he was inside, the night had already absorbed any trace of his arrival. The first confrontation was never chaotic. It was controlled, deliberate, shaped by a voice that carried authority without needing volume. Parents woke not to noise, but to the realization that someone was already there, standing in the dim light, holding a weapon that made resistance feel impossible. There was a stillness in those moments, a kind of suspended reality where fear replaced instinct. He spoke calmly, issuing instructions with the certainty of someone who expected to be obeyed. And he was. Hands were tied. Bodies were positioned. Every movement dictated, every hesitation met with quiet reinforcement of what would happen if they failed to comply. There was no shouting, no frenzy. Only the steady unfolding of a plan that had been rehearsed in his mind long before this night. Then came the shift. His attention moved away from the parents and toward the child. It was in that transition that the true nature of the intrusion became clear. This was not a burglary, not an act driven by opportunity. It was something far more specific, far more unsettling. The house, the family, the entire setting had been chosen for a reason that existed only within him. The child's room, once a space of comfort, became the center of something unthinkable. The soft glow of a nightlight, the quiet arrangement of familiar objects, all of it remained unchanged, yet everything felt different. The presence of the intruder altered the space in a way that could not be undone. He approached with the same measured calm, his face concealed, his identity reduced to a voice and a set of controlled movements. He spoke to the child as he had spoken to the parents, instructing, guiding, maintaining control through tone rather than force. It was a method that relied on fear, but also on something more calculated, the understanding that compliance could be achieved without chaos. In some cases, the child was taken. Removed from the house with a precision that suggested prior planning, as if the route had been mapped out step by step. The journey into the night was disorienting, marked by the loss of familiar surroundings and the introduction of deliberate sensory control. Blindfolds were used, sounds masked by the constant presence of a radio or television turned up too loud. It was not just about concealment, but about disorientation, about ensuring that nothing could be clearly remembered, nothing that might later lead back to him. Time, in those moments, lost its usual meaning. Hours stretched and contracted unpredictably, shaped not by clocks but by the controlled environment he created. There were fragments of normality woven into the experience, food offered, instructions given in a calm voice, routines imposed that felt almost ordinary in isolation. But beneath that surface was an unshakable awareness that none of it was normal, that every detail was part of a larger design meant to control, to confuse, to dominate. For those who were returned, the end of the ordeal came as abruptly as it had begun. Left in unfamiliar places, often far from home, they were forced to navigate their way back to safety, carrying with them memories that were both vivid and incomplete. They could describe the voice, the manner, the careful way he avoided revealing himself. But the most crucial detail, the identity behind the mask, remained out of reach. For others, there was no return. The case that would come to define the full extent of this terror unfolded in 1991, when Carmine Chan was taken from her home. The pattern, by then, was recognizable to investigators, though still not fully understood. The same quiet entry, the same controlled environment, the same calculated removal. But this time, the ending would not follow the established sequence. Days passed, then weeks, with no sign of her. The absence that had once been temporary in previous cases became something else entirely, something heavier, more final. The search expanded, the urgency intensified, but the trail remained elusive. It was as if the careful precision that defined the earlier incidents had been taken even further, leaving behind even less to hold on to. When her body was eventually discovered, it marked a turning point, not just in the investigation, but in the way these crimes were understood. The possibility that had always lingered beneath the surface, that the man responsible was capable of more than what had already been seen, became undeniable. The name that had once described a pattern of calculated intrusion now carried the weight of something far more irreversible. Across all these incidents, there was a consistency that both guided and frustrated those trying to understand him. The methodical approach, the controlled interactions, the deliberate avoidance of identification. It suggested a mind that valued order, that approached each act not as a moment of impulse, but as a process to be executed with precision. And yet, within that structure, there were elements that resisted easy explanation. The choice to release some victims while keeping others. The careful management of time, the specific conditions under which each incident unfolded. These were not random variations, but they did not form a pattern that could be easily predicted. What remained constant was the impact. Each incident left behind a ripple that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Families were forced to confront a reality in which their homes were no longer secure. Communities began to question the assumptions that had once defined their sense of safety. The night, once a time of rest, became something to be endured, listened to, watched more closely. And through it all, the man at the center of these events remained unseen. A presence defined not by what was known, but by what could not be discovered. A figure who moved through these carefully constructed moments and then vanished, leaving behind only fragments, only the echoes of what had happened. The incidents themselves were not just acts of violence. They were demonstrations of control, of planning, of an ability to impose order on chaos in a way that made them all the more disturbing. Each one built upon the last, adding layers to a pattern that was both recognizable and deeply elusive. By the time investigators began to fully grasp the scope of what they were dealing with, the damage had already been done. The pattern was established. The fear had taken root. And the man responsible had proven, time and again, that he could enter a home, alter lives forever, and disappear without leaving behind anything that could bring him to justice. At least, not yet. By the time the first officers arrived, the night had already begun to thin into something colder, more fragile. The kind of early morning darkness that feels different from midnight, less certain, as if the world is preparing to wake but hasn't quite committed. Patrol cars rolled quietly into streets that still looked untouched, the same trimmed hedges, the same dim porch lights, the same illusion of normalcy. From the outside, nothing suggested what had just unfolded inside one of those homes. There were no broken windows, no doors hanging open, no signs of struggle spilling out into the street. Just a house like any other, holding something that did not belong. Inside, the air carried a different weight. The first thing the officers noticed was not what they could see, but what they could feel. A tension that lingered in the silence, a residue of fear that had not yet settled. The family, shaken and disoriented, moved through the space as if it no longer belonged to them. Their voices came in fragments, overlapping, incomplete. Every sentence seemed to begin in the middle, as if the beginning had been lost somewhere between the moment of intrusion and the moment help arrived. The living room, the hallway, the bedrooms, each space was both familiar and altered. Objects were exactly where they should be, yet nothing felt in place. A chair slightly out of alignment. A door left open at an angle that suggested it had been handled by someone who did not live there. These were not the dramatic signs investigators often relied on. They were subtle, almost insignificant on their own. But together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The parents described what they could, though even as they spoke, there was a sense that language was not enough. They talked about waking to a presence, about a figure already inside the room, about a voice that remained calm in a way that made everything feel more dangerous. They described the weapon, the instructions, the way their bodies had responded not with resistance, but with compliance. Fear had not erupted into chaos. It had settled into something quieter, something that guided their actions with a clarity they did not fully understand. Investigators moved carefully, aware that the most important details were often the easiest to disturb. Gloves were worn, movements deliberate. Every surface became a potential source of information. Door handles, window frames, light switches, places where a trace might exist, even if it could not yet be seen. But almost immediately, a pattern began to emerge, one that would define the investigation from that point forward. There was very little to find. No obvious fingerprints. No clear marks of forced entry. The usual indicators that might guide an investigation were either absent or too faint to hold on to. It was as if the intruder had passed through the house without leaving behind anything solid enough to confirm he had been there at all. And yet, his presence was undeniable, written into the experience of those who had encountered him. The child's room drew particular attention. It was here that the contrast between before and after felt most pronounced. The small details of a young life remained intact, toys arranged in familiar patterns, books stacked or left open, clothing draped over a chair. But layered over that normalcy was something else, something that could not be photographed or collected. A disruption that existed in memory rather than in physical form. Investigators listened closely to the accounts provided by the child, understanding that these fragments might be the only direct connection to the person they were trying to identify. The descriptions were careful, shaped by both fear and uncertainty. A mask. Gloves. A voice that remained steady, almost controlled to the point of being unnatural. There were no clear features to hold on to, no distinguishing marks that could be easily shared and recognized. The very precautions that had been taken during the incident now extended into the investigation, limiting what could be known. In other cases, when a victim had been taken and later released, the discovery unfolded in a different kind of space. A roadside, a patch of land that existed on the edge of familiarity, neither fully isolated nor entirely connected to the places people moved through every day. The child would be found or would find her way to someone who could help, carrying with her the same mixture of clarity and uncertainty. She could describe the experience, the controlled environment, the deliberate efforts to conceal location and identity. But the place itself, the one where she had been held, remained just out of reach, defined more by sensation than by geography. These discoveries added new layers to the investigation, but they also introduced new challenges. Each detail had to be examined, compared, placed within a broader context. The presence of a radio or television playing loudly, the use of blindfolds, the careful management of time, all of it suggested a level of planning that went beyond what investigators typically encountered. This was not someone acting on impulse. This was someone who had thought through each step, who understood not just how to commit the crime, but how to limit what could be learned afterward. Forensic teams worked methodically, even when the evidence seemed scarce. Fibers were collected, however small. Soil samples examined, even when their origin could not be immediately determined. Every trace was treated as significant, not because it offered clear answers, but because it represented one of the few connections to a presence that was otherwise almost invisible. As more incidents were linked together, the concept of a single offender began to solidify. The similarities between cases were too consistent to ignore. The method of entry, the control of the environment, the specific focus on young girls within a narrow age range. These were not coincidences. They were signatures, not in the sense of something intentionally left behind, but in the repetition of behavior that revealed a pattern. The name that would come to define this pattern, Mr. Cruel, was not yet fully established in those early stages. But the idea of him was already taking shape. An individual who operated with precision, who understood how to minimize risk, who seemed to anticipate the investigative process and adjust accordingly. It was this understanding that made the lack of physical evidence feel even more significant. It was not simply that evidence was missing. It was that it had likely been avoided. In the most devastating case, the discovery carried a different kind of finality. When the remains of Carmine Chan were found, the investigation entered a new phase. The location, removed from the suburban settings of the earlier incidents, suggested a deliberate effort to distance the act from the place where it began. The scene itself offered its own set of clues, but like the others, they were limited, fragmented. Enough to confirm what had happened, but not enough to clearly identify who was responsible. The emotional weight of that discovery was immediate and profound. For investigators, it marked the transition from a series of controlled intrusions and abductions to something that carried irreversible consequences. For the community, it shattered any remaining belief that these incidents might follow a pattern that allowed for survival. The unknown had taken on a new dimension, one that could no longer be contained within the boundaries of previous understanding. Back in the suburbs, the homes where these events had begun remained standing, outwardly unchanged. But inside, they had become part of a larger narrative, one that extended beyond their walls. Each one represented a point on a map that investigators studied relentlessly, searching for connections that might reveal something previously overlooked. Distances were measured, timelines constructed, patterns analyzed. And yet, despite all of this, the central question remained unanswered. Who had done this? The scenes themselves, whether inside a quiet home or in a remote location where a life had been taken, offered only fragments. Pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together in a way that made sense. The more investigators looked, the more they understood the nature of what they were facing. This was not a case defined by a lack of effort or attention. It was defined by the presence of someone who had designed his actions to leave as little behind as possible. In that absence, the investigation had to rely on something less tangible. Patterns of behavior, psychological insights, the careful comparison of details that might seem insignificant on their own but meaningful when viewed together. It was a process that required patience, persistence, and a willingness to follow leads that often led nowhere. The discovery phase of these cases did not provide closure. It did not offer clear direction. Instead, it revealed the scale of the challenge ahead. Each scene, each fragment of evidence, each account from those who had experienced the unthinkable added to a growing understanding of the offender, even as his identity remained hidden. And in that growing understanding, there was a realization that made everything more urgent. Whoever he was, he had done this more than once. And he could do it again. The investigation did not unfold in a straight line. It never does in cases like this. Instead, it spread outward in widening circles, each lead branching into another, each possibility opening the door to dozens more. Inside the headquarters of Victoria Police, rooms filled with files, maps, photographs, and notes became the physical representation of a puzzle that refused to be solved. Detectives moved between them with a kind of controlled urgency, aware that every hour mattered, yet equally aware that rushing could mean missing the one detail that might change everything. At the center of it all was a question that seemed simple but resisted every attempt at resolution. Who was he? The name Mr. Cruel had by now taken hold in both the media and the public consciousness, a label that carried weight but offered no substance. It was a placeholder for an identity that remained frustratingly out of reach. Investigators did not have the luxury of thinking in terms of names. They worked with patterns, behaviors, fragments of description that had to be assembled into something resembling a profile. And the profile, when it began to take shape, was unsettling. This was not someone acting on impulse. Every element of the crimes suggested planning, patience, and an understanding of risk that went beyond instinct. He chose his targets carefully, selecting homes in areas where his presence would not immediately stand out. He operated at times when the likelihood of interruption was minimal. He controlled the environment in ways that reduced the chances of leaving behind evidence. Even his interactions with victims were measured, designed to maintain dominance without escalating into chaos. It was this level of control that led investigators to consider the possibility that he had some form of knowledge or experience related to law enforcement or criminal investigation. Not necessarily direct involvement, but an awareness of how cases were built, how evidence was collected, how mistakes could lead to identification. It was a theory that gained traction not because it could be proven, but because it helped explain what they were seeing, or rather, what they were not seeing. But theories alone were not enough. The practical side of the investigation required something more tangible. Names. Faces. Individuals who could be questioned, observed, eliminated or, in the best-case scenario, identified as the person responsible. This process began broadly, encompassing anyone who fit even the most general aspects of the emerging profile. Men living in or near the affected areas. Individuals with prior offenses related to intrusion or violence. People whose routines or behaviors raised even the slightest suspicion. The number of potential suspects quickly grew into the hundreds, then the thousands. Each one represented a possibility, however remote. Each one required time, resources, and attention. Detectives conducted interviews, reviewed records, followed up on tips that ranged from credible to improbable. Some leads came from within the community, neighbors who remembered something unusual, acquaintances who noticed changes in behavior, individuals who felt compelled to report even the smallest detail. Others came from outside, shaped by the media coverage that had begun to amplify the case, drawing in information from across the region. Most of these leads went nowhere. They ended in explanations that made sense, in alibis that could be verified, in details that, while initially suspicious, ultimately proved unrelated. But each dead end carried its own cost. Time spent pursuing one lead meant time not spent on another. Resources allocated to one suspect meant fewer available for the rest. And through it all, the awareness remained that the real offender was still out there, untouched by the process unfolding around him. One name, however, began to surface more persistently than others. Norman Lee was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. He had a history, one that included offenses involving children, behavior that placed him within the scope of what investigators were looking for. His background, his location, certain aspects of his life, all of it aligned just enough with the emerging profile to warrant closer attention. The focus on him was not immediate or singular. It developed over time, as information was gathered, as connections were explored. Detectives examined his movements, his routines, his potential access to the areas where the crimes had occurred. They looked for inconsistencies, for gaps that could not be easily explained. Interviews were conducted, questions asked and answered, each interaction adding another layer to the assessment. For a moment, it seemed possible. Not in the sense of certainty, but in the way that a puzzle piece appears to fit when placed in the right position. There were elements that aligned, details that suggested he could be capable of such acts. The investigation tightened around him, attention narrowing in a way that had not yet happened with other suspects. But then, as had happened before, the cracks began to show. Evidence that could firmly place him at the scenes did not materialize. The connections, while suggestive, remained circumstantial. There were explanations for certain aspects of his behavior, alibis that could not be easily dismissed, gaps that could not be bridged with the information available. The more closely investigators examined the case against him, the more they were forced to confront a difficult reality. Suspicion was not proof. And in a case like this, where the margin for error was so small, proof was everything. Reluctantly, the focus shifted. Not entirely away from him, but no longer centered on him as the primary solution. He remained a person of interest, a name within the broader pool of possibilities, but not the answer investigators were searching for. This pattern repeated itself with other suspects. Individuals who, for a time, seemed to fit. Men whose backgrounds raised questions, whose behaviors aligned in unsettling ways with the known details of the crimes. Each one brought a brief surge of momentum, a sense that the investigation might be moving closer to resolution. And each one, eventually, led back to the same place. Uncertainty. The challenge was not just identifying potential suspects, but narrowing them down in a way that could withstand scrutiny. Without clear physical evidence, without a definitive link tying any individual to the crimes, the investigation relied heavily on inference, on the careful interpretation of patterns and behaviors. It was a process that required both intuition and restraint, the ability to recognize possibilities without allowing them to harden into conclusions prematurely. Meanwhile, the public pressure continued to build. Media coverage intensified, each new development reported, analyzed, discussed. The name Mr. Cruel became more than just a label, it became a symbol of fear, of something that could not be easily understood or controlled. Communities demanded answers, reassurance, some indication that the person responsible would be found and stopped. For the investigators, this added another layer of complexity. They were not only working against the limitations of the evidence, but also against time and expectation. Every day that passed without an arrest was another day in which the offender remained free, another day in which the possibility of further incidents lingered in the background. Internally, the investigation evolved. Behavioral analysts contributed their perspectives, attempting to construct a psychological profile that might offer additional direction. They considered the level of planning involved, the choice of victims, the methods used to control and disorient. They looked for patterns not just in the actions, but in what those actions might reveal about the person behind them. The conclusions, while informative, were not definitive. They suggested someone who was organized, intelligent, capable of maintaining a double life. Someone who could blend into his environment, who likely held a job or position that allowed him to appear ordinary. There were indications of patience, of discipline, of an ability to delay gratification in favor of long-term planning. But these were characteristics that could apply to many people. Too many. As the investigation stretched on, the sense of momentum became harder to maintain. Leads continued to come in, suspects continued to be evaluated, but the distance between possibility and certainty remained unchanged. The case grew in size, in complexity, in the sheer volume of information that had to be managed. And still, at the center of it all, there was a void. No name. No face. No definitive answer. The man they were searching for existed only in fragments, in the memories of victims, in the patterns of his actions, in the absence of evidence that spoke as loudly as any physical trace. He was defined as much by what he had not left behind as by what he had done. For the investigators, this was both the greatest challenge and the most unsettling aspect of the case. Because it meant that, despite everything they had done, everything they had learned, they were still searching for someone who had managed to remain invisible. And until that changed, every suspect was both a possibility and a reminder of how far they still had to go. By the time the investigation reached what many hoped would be its turning point, the weight of everything that had come before it could be felt in every decision, every conversation, every piece of evidence revisited yet again. There is a moment in long, unresolved cases when the search for answers stops feeling like a forward motion and begins to resemble a slow tightening spiral, circling back over the same ground but with sharper focus, more urgency. And a growing sense that whatever had been missed before might still be there, waiting to be seen differently. For the detectives within Victoria Police, that moment did not arrive suddenly. It emerged gradually, built from frustration, from exhaustion, from the realization that conventional methods had carried them as far as they could go. The evidence had not changed, but the way they approached it had to. Files were reopened. Statements reread. Timelines reconstructed with an almost obsessive attention to detail. The smallest inconsistencies, the faintest patterns that had once seemed coincidental, were now examined as if they might hold the key to everything. It was no longer enough to ask what had happened. The question shifted to why it had happened in exactly that way, at exactly that time, in exactly that place. And in that shift, something began to emerge. Not a name, not a face, but a clearer shape of the man behind it all. He was no longer just an absence, no longer just the figure who moved silently through homes and vanished without a trace. He became, in the minds of investigators, a presence defined by choices. Each decision he had made, where to strike, when to act, how to control his victims, formed a pattern that, when viewed as a whole, suggested something more deliberate than previously understood. One of the most significant realizations centered around timing. The attacks did not occur randomly. They aligned, in subtle but consistent ways, with moments when attention elsewhere was heightened. Major public events, holidays, periods when police resources were stretched thinner than usual. It was not an obvious pattern at first glance, but once considered, it became difficult to ignore. Whoever he was not only planning his actions within the confines of a single household. He was planning them within the broader context of the city itself. That realization changed the way investigators thought about him. This was not just someone who understood how to enter a home undetected. This was someone who understood systems. Someone who could anticipate how resources would be allocated, how attention would shift, how the environment around him could be used to his advantage. It suggested a level of awareness that went beyond instinct, beyond even careful observation. It suggested knowledge. With that came a renewed focus on individuals who might possess such understanding. Not just those with criminal histories, but those whose professions, routines, or interests might provide insight into how investigations unfolded, how patrols were scheduled, how attention could be diverted. The pool of suspects did not necessarily shrink, but it shifted, becoming more specific in ways that felt both promising and deeply unsettling. At the same time, advances in forensic thinking, if not yet in technology, began to influence the approach. Even though the physical evidence remained limited, the way it was interpreted evolved. Investigators revisited collected materials, not expecting new discoveries, but hoping for new perspectives. A fiber that once seemed insignificant might now be compared differently. A detail in a victim's account might be cross-referenced with another in a way that revealed a connection previously overlooked. There were moments, brief, intense moments, when it felt as though the case was about to break open. A new lead would surface, supported by details that aligned just enough to create a sense of momentum. Detectives would follow it with renewed energy, piecing together information, building a narrative that seemed to point toward a single individual. The structure of the case would begin to form, fragile but coherent, as if all the scattered fragments were finally assembling into something solid. And then, just as quickly, it would falter. A discrepancy that could not be resolved. An alibi that held under scrutiny. A piece of evidence that did not quite fit, no matter how it was examined. The structure would collapse, leaving behind the same scattered fragments, now accompanied by a deeper sense of frustration. But each of these near breakthroughs had an effect. They refined the understanding of what the true breakthrough would need to look like. Not just plausible, not just suggestive, but undeniable. Something that could withstand not only investigative scrutiny, but the scrutiny of a court, of a public that had grown increasingly invested in the outcome. The case also began to benefit from the passage of time in unexpected ways. People who had once been hesitant to come forward began to reconsider. Memories that had seemed unimportant gained new significance in the context of what was now known. Tips that had been overlooked or deprioritized were revisited, sometimes revealing details that had been missed in the initial rush of the investigation. It was in one of these revisitations that a particularly intriguing line of inquiry developed. A pattern of movement. Not tied to a single suspect, but to a series of locations, times, and observations that, when mapped together, suggested a possible area of familiarity for the offender. It was not precise enough to identify a specific address, but it narrowed the focus in a way that felt different from previous efforts. Instead of searching across vast suburban expanses, investigators could begin to concentrate on a smaller, more defined region. Within that region, the possibilities became more manageable, but also more intense. Every individual who fit the emerging profile within that space came under increased scrutiny. Backgrounds were examined in greater depth. Connections were explored more thoroughly. The hope was that, within this narrower field, the missing link might finally reveal itself. At the same time, the psychological profile continued to evolve. Analysts began to consider not just who he might be, but how he might have changed over time. The gap between incidents, the escalation in severity, the eventual shift toward a more permanent outcome, all of these suggested a progression, a trajectory that could offer clues about his current state. Was he still active? Had he stopped? Had something in his life altered his behavior, or simply his methods? These questions did not have immediate answers, but they shaped the direction of the investigation in subtle ways. The idea of a breakthrough, once imagined as a single, decisive moment, began to take on a different form. It was no longer expected to arrive as a sudden revelation, a piece of evidence that would instantly resolve everything. Instead, it was understood as something that might emerge gradually, built from the accumulation of insights, from the slow alignment of details that had once seemed unrelated. And yet, despite all of this progress, all of this refinement, the final step remained out of reach. The turning point, if it existed, was incomplete. The investigation had moved closer, had sharpened its focus, had deepened its understanding of the man they were searching for. But understanding was not the same as identification. Knowing how he operated did not reveal who he was. Recognizing patterns did not produce a name. Still, something had changed. The case was no longer defined solely by what was missing. It was now shaped by what had been learned, by the structure that had been built around those absences. The outline of the truth was there, clearer than it had ever been before. All that remained was to fill it in. And somewhere, beyond the reach of every lead, every theory, every near breakthrough, the man known as Mr. Cruel continued to exist as both the center of the story and the one element that refused to be fully brought into the light. There is a moment that every investigation is meant to reach, a point where uncertainty gives way to clarity, where a name replaces a shadow and the long, exhausting search finally resolves into something solid enough to stand in a courtroom. It is the moment people imagine when they follow cases like this, the inevitable conclusion where evidence is laid out, questions are answered, and justice takes a recognizable form. But for the detectives who had spent years pursuing the man known as Mr. Cruel, that moment never arrived in the way it was supposed to. There was no arrest that brought a sudden end to the fear. No suspect led into a courtroom under the weight of undeniable proof. No trial where witnesses could point across the room and say with certainty, "That is him." Instead, there was an absence where that moment should have been, a silence that settled over the case as time passed without resolution. The system that had been built to deliver answers, to transform suspicion into accountability, found itself confronting something it could not easily contain. And yet, the idea of justice did not disappear. It shifted. Within Victoria Police, the case remained open, not as a formality, but as a reflection of a commitment that refused to fade. Files were not closed and forgotten, they were preserved, revisited, carried forward by new investigators who inherited not just the evidence, but the weight of everything it represented. Each generation of detectives approached the case with the same question, the same determination, even as the distance from the original events grew longer. There were attempts, over the years, to move closer to that missing courtroom moment. Advancements in forensic science offered possibilities that had not existed during the initial investigation. Evidence that had once been considered too limited or too degraded was re-examined, subjected to new techniques, new methods of analysis. The hope was that somewhere within those preserved fragments, something might emerge, a trace of DNA, a connection that had previously been invisible. But hope, in cases like this, often moves in parallel with frustration. The material that had been collected was never abundant, and what existed had been shaped by an offender who seemed acutely aware of how to avoid leaving behind what could be used against him. The passage of time, while beneficial in some ways, also introduced its own challenges. Memories faded, witnesses became harder to locate, the context of certain details became less clear. Each new attempt to push the case forward had to contend not only with what was missing from the beginning, but with what had been lost along the way. In the public sphere, the expectation of a trial lingered, even as the likelihood of it diminished. People wanted to see a face, to hear a verdict, to experience the sense of closure that comes from a story reaching its defined end. The name Mr. Cruel had become so ingrained, so familiar, that it almost demanded resolution. But the reality of the situation resisted that demand. Without a suspect who could be charged, without evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of a court, the process could not move forward in the way people expected. And so, the courtroom remained empty. Not in a literal sense, but in the context of this case. The place where justice is typically enacted, where narratives are constructed and deconstructed, where truth is argued and determined, never became part of this story in a direct way. There were no opening statements outlining the sequence of events, no cross-examinations probing the reliability of testimony, no closing arguments attempting to bring everything together into a coherent whole. But that does not mean the case lacked confrontation. The confrontation existed in a different form, one that unfolded over years rather than hours. It was the ongoing effort to match what was known against what remained hidden, to test theories against the limitations of evidence, to push against the boundaries of uncertainty. It was a confrontation between the investigators and the absence at the center of the case, a constant attempt to force that absence to reveal itself. There were moments when it seemed as though that confrontation might finally produce a result. New suspects emerged, sometimes years after the original incidents, brought forward by fresh information or by connections that had not been recognized before. Each time, the process began again, background checks, interviews, comparisons of timelines and behaviors. Each time, there was a possibility, however small, that this might be the individual who had remained hidden for so long. And each time, the same barrier remained. Insufficient evidence. In a courtroom, that phrase carries enormous weight. It is the line between accusation and conviction, between suspicion and proof. It is what protects individuals from being judged without certainty, but it is also what prevents cases like this from reaching resolution. No matter how compelling a theory might be, no matter how closely a suspect seems to align with the known details, without evidence that meets the required standard, the process cannot move forward. This tension defines the justice phase of the Mr. Cruel case. On one side, there is the need for accountability, the desire to identify and confront the person responsible for such calculated and devastating acts. On the other, there is the necessity of certainty, the requirement that any accusation be supported by evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny. When those two elements cannot be aligned, the result is a kind of unresolved state, where justice is pursued but not fully realized. For the families, this creates a different kind of burden. The absence of a trial means the absence of a formal acknowledgement, a moment where the events are laid out in a structured way, where responsibility is assigned and recognized. Instead, they are left with a narrative that exists primarily in investigative files, in media reports, in the collective memory of those who have followed the case. It is real, undeniably so, but it lacks the finality that a courtroom can provide. And yet, within that absence, there is also a form of persistence. The case has not been abandoned. It has not been relegated to history as something that no longer matters. It continues to exist as an active question, one that remains open, one that can still, in theory, be answered. Advances in technology, changes in investigative approaches, new information that might surface unexpectedly, all of these represent possibilities, however distant. Justice, in this context, becomes something less immediate but no less important. It is not a single event, not a verdict delivered at the end of a trial. It is an ongoing process, a commitment to continue searching, to continue questioning, to refuse to let the absence of answers become permanent. It exists in the work of investigators who revisit the case, in the attention it continues to receive, in the refusal to accept that it cannot be solved. The courtroom, for now, remains hypothetical. A space that could one day hold the resolution of this story, but has not yet been filled. A place where the fragments of evidence might finally come together, where the patterns that have been studied for so long might be connected to a single individual, where the name Mr. Cruel might be replaced with something real. Until that happens, the justice in this case remains incomplete. Not absent, but unfinished. A process still in motion, still waiting for the moment when the shadow at its center can finally be brought into the light and made to stand, not as a mystery, but as a person who can be held accountable for what he has done. Time does something strange to stories like this. It softens the edges in some places while sharpening them in others, allowing certain details to fade while others remain painfully clear. In the quiet suburbs of Melbourne, the streets have not changed as much as one might expect. The houses still stand, repainted, renovated, lived in by new families who carry their own routines into spaces that once held something far darker. Children still ride their bikes along the sidewalks, laughter still drifts through the air in the late afternoon, and for the most part, life continues in the way it always has. But beneath that continuity, there is a memory that does not fully disappear. It exists not as a constant presence, but as something that can be felt in certain moments. In the way doors are locked a little more carefully. In the way parents pause, just briefly, before turning off the lights at night. In the quiet awareness that safety is not something guaranteed, but something maintained, protected, sometimes questioned. The name Mr. Cruel has, over the years, become both specific and abstract. Specific in that it refers to a series of real events, real victims, real families whose lives were changed forever. Abstract in that it no longer points to a known individual, but to an idea, a reminder of how easily normal life can be disrupted by someone who understands how to move within it unseen. For those who lived through it, the story does not belong to the past in the same way it does for others. It is not something that can be neatly placed into history, defined by dates and events and then set aside. It lingers in memory, in the spaces between ordinary moments, in the awareness that what happened once could, in some form, happen again. That awareness does not dominate every day, but it does not fully leave either. For the victims, the passage of time brings its own complexity. There is healing, in ways that are both visible and invisible. Lives continue, paths are formed, identities shaped not only by what was done to them, but by everything that came after. And yet, the experiences remain part of that identity, woven into it in ways that cannot be undone. The past does not define everything, but it is always there, a layer beneath the surface. For the family of Carmine Chan, the absence carries a different weight. It is not just the memory of what happened, but the space left behind by what never had the chance to happen. The years that should have followed, the milestones that were never reached, the future that was interrupted before it could fully take shape. Time moves forward, but it does so around that absence, never quite filling it, never quite resolving it. In a broader sense, the case reshaped something within the community itself. Before, there had been an assumption, often unspoken, that certain places were inherently safe. That by choosing the right neighborhood, by following the right routines, risk could be minimized to the point of near impossibility. The events associated with Mr. Cruel challenged that assumption in a way that could not be easily forgotten. Safety, it became clear, was not just about location or routine. It was about awareness. About understanding that risk does not always announce itself in obvious ways, that it can exist quietly, patiently, within the same spaces where ordinary life unfolds. This realization did not lead to constant fear, but it did introduce a different kind of vigilance, one that became part of the fabric of daily life. The investigation, though unresolved, also left behind something significant. It demonstrated the limits of what can be known, even with sustained effort, even with the full resources of law enforcement. It showed that there are cases where the absence of evidence is not due to a lack of investigation, but to the deliberate actions of someone who understood how to avoid leaving traces. This is not a comforting realization, but it is an important one. Because it shifts the focus from expectation to persistence. The case remains open, not because it is easy to solve, but because it matters enough not to be closed. Within Victoria Police, it exists as a reminder that some questions require time measured not in days or years, but in decades. That answers may come from places not yet considered, from technologies not yet developed, from connections not yet made. And so, the story continues. Not in the sense of new events unfolding, but in the ongoing effort to understand, to remember, to seek resolution. It lives in the files that are revisited, in the discussions that continue, in the hope, quiet but persistent, that one day, the missing piece will be found. There is also a broader message that emerges from all of this, one that extends beyond a single case. It is a reminder of the importance of seeing victims as more than moments within a narrative of crime. Of recognizing their lives in full, not just the parts that intersect with tragedy. Of understanding that behind every investigation, every headline, every unanswered question, there are people whose experiences cannot be reduced to a single event. And perhaps, most importantly, it is a reminder of the need for balance. Between awareness and fear. Between vigilance and trust. Between the recognition of risk and the ability to continue living without being defined by it. The story of Mr. Cruel does not end with a clear resolution. It does not offer the satisfaction of a final answer or the closure of a completed arc. Instead, it leaves something open, something unresolved, something that resists the simplicity of a conclusion. But within that lack of closure, there is still meaning. In the persistence of those who continue to seek answers. In the resilience of those who were affected. In the way communities adapt, remember, and move forward while carrying the lessons of what has happened. And somewhere, beyond what is currently known, the truth still exists. Waiting. Not as a certainty, but as a possibility. A reminder that even in the absence of answers, the search itself holds value, and that some stories, no matter how long they remain unresolved, are never truly finished. There is a final layer to stories like this that rarely gets spoken about, because it does not belong to the moment of the crime, nor to the investigation, nor even to the long shadow of aftermath. It belongs to what remains when everything else has been said, when the details have been examined from every angle, when the timelines have been constructed and reconstructed until they feel almost mechanical. It is the quiet space where a question lingers without urgency, without noise, but with a persistence that refuses to fade. Who was he, really, when no one was watching? Not the masked figure moving through darkened hallways, not the controlled voice issuing instructions, not the calculated presence that seemed to exist only in those carefully chosen moments. But the person beyond that. The version of him that existed in daylight, in ordinary interactions, in places where no one suspected anything at all. It is an unsettling thought, not because it provides answers, but because it highlights the absence of them. Somewhere in the suburbs of Melbourne, during those same years, there was a man who lived a life that, on the surface, did not draw attention. He may have had a job, colleagues, routines that appeared as predictable as those of the families he targeted. He may have exchanged greetings with neighbors, stood in line at shops, moved through the same public spaces as everyone else without leaving an impression. And all the while, there existed this other dimension to his life, one that operated in complete isolation from the rest. The ability to maintain that separation, to move between those two realities without overlap, is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of this case to fully grasp. It suggests a level of compartmentalization that goes beyond what most people can imagine. A capacity to divide the self in such a way that one part can function within society while another operates entirely outside of it. It raises questions that do not have easy answers. Was there ever a moment when those two parts collided, even briefly? A hesitation, a mistake, a glimpse of something that did not fit the surface? Or was the separation so complete that it remained intact, never revealing itself in a way that others could recognize? These questions extend beyond the individual and into something broader. They touch on the limits of perception, on how much people can truly know about those around them. In communities built on familiarity, on the assumption that repeated interactions create understanding, there is a tendency to believe that dangerous individuals will somehow stand out. That there will be signs, indicators, something that signals their difference. But cases like this challenge that belief. They suggest that, under certain conditions, someone can exist within those same communities without detection, not because people are inattentive, but because the behaviors that define them in one context do not translate into another. The person seen during the day is not the same as the one who moves through the night, and the distance between those identities is maintained with deliberate care. This does not mean that the community failed. It means that the nature of what they were facing was designed to avoid recognition. There is also the question of change. Time alters people, sometimes in gradual ways, sometimes in sudden shifts that are difficult to trace. If the man known as Mr. Cruel is still alive, he exists now in a different phase of life, shaped not only by what he did, but by everything that has happened since. Age, circumstance, the accumulation of years, all of these factors introduce possibilities that complicate the narrative. Did he stop? If so, why? Was it a decision, a change in circumstance, a shift in whatever internal logic guided his actions? Or was it something external, something that removed the opportunity or the ability to continue? These are questions that investigators have considered, not because they offer closure, but because they influence how the case is understood in the present. If he did not stop, then the story extends beyond what is currently known, into spaces and times that have not yet been connected. That possibility, while unsettling, is part of what keeps the case alive, part of what drives the continued attention, the ongoing review of evidence, the openness to new information. And then there is the question of memory. Not just individual memory, but collective memory, the way a community holds onto a story, how it evolves over time, how it is passed from one generation to the next. The name Mr. Cruel has become part of that collective memory, not always at the forefront, but present enough to be recognized, to be understood as something significant. For those who were not there, who know the case only through retellings, through articles or documentaries, the story can take on a different quality. It can feel distant, almost abstract, shaped by the structure of narrative rather than the immediacy of experience. But for those who lived through it, who felt the shift in their sense of safety, who remember the nights when the quiet felt different, it remains grounded in something real. That difference in perspective is important. It reminds us that true crime is not just about events, but about the ways those events are experienced, remembered, and interpreted. It is about the intersection between what happened and how it continues to matter. In the absence of resolution, the story resists a traditional ending. There is no final scene where everything is explained, no moment where all the threads are tied together. Instead, it exists in a state of continuation, not in terms of new crimes, but in terms of ongoing relevance. The questions remain, the search continues, the possibility of an answer persists. And perhaps that is where the final reflection lies. Not in trying to force an ending where one does not yet exist, but in acknowledging the complexity of a story that refuses to be simplified. in recognizing that some cases challenge not only investigative methods, but also expectations about how stories are supposed to conclude. There is a kind of honesty in that. An understanding that uncertainty is not a failure, but a condition that can exist even in the presence of sustained effort, expertise, and determination. It does not diminish the work that has been done, nor does it erase the significance of what has been learned. Instead, it highlights the limits of what is currently known, while leaving space for what might still be discovered. Somewhere, the truth exists in its complete form. Not as fragments, not as patterns or theories, but as a sequence of events tied to a single, identifiable individual. Whether that truth will ever be fully uncovered remains uncertain. But the fact that it is still being sought, still being pursued, is itself meaningful. Because it means the story is not being allowed to fade. It means that the lives affected by these events are not being reduced to unanswered questions and then forgotten. It means that, even without resolution, there is a commitment to remembering, to understanding, to continuing the search. And in that ongoing search, there is something that endures. Not closure, not certainty, but a refusal to accept that silence is the final word. Long after the headlines faded and the urgency of nightly news updates gave way to quieter retrospectives, the case settled into a different kind of existence, one that lived not in breaking developments but in the slow accumulation of reflection, analysis, and unresolved questions. In the suburbs of Melbourne, life continued in ways that, on the surface, appeared unchanged, but beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be fully undone no matter how much time passed. It was not fear in its most visible form, not the kind that stops people from living their lives, but something subtler, something woven into the way people thought about safety, about trust, about the unseen spaces within their own routines. The legacy of what had happened did not demand constant attention, but it remained present, like a faint echo that could be heard only in certain moments, when the world grew quiet enough for memory to surface. For investigators, the case had become more than a single pursuit. It had evolved into a reference point, something studied not only for the possibility of resolution but for what it revealed about the nature of certain crimes and the individuals who commit them. Within Victoria Police, it was no longer just an active file, but also a lesson, a complex example of how methodical planning, psychological control, and an understanding of investigative limitations could combine to create a scenario where traditional approaches struggled to produce definitive answers. New detectives, entering the force years after the original incidents, encountered the case not as a current event but as a challenge that still remained unsolved, a reminder that even with experience, training, and resources, there are situations that resist closure. The analysis of the offender's behavior continued to evolve over time, shaped by developments in criminology, psychology, and forensic science. Experts revisited the patterns, the methods, the decisions that had once seemed isolated but now formed a clearer, though still incomplete, picture. They examined the level of control exhibited during the incidents, the calculated use of fear, the deliberate avoidance of identification, and the ability to maintain consistency across multiple events. These elements suggested not just a criminal, but an individual who operated with a framework, a set of internal rules that guided his actions and allowed him to repeat them with precision. It was this framework that both defined him and concealed him, creating a pattern that could be recognized but not easily traced back to a single identity. There was also a growing understanding of the role that environment played in the case. The suburban setting, once seen primarily as a backdrop, became a factor in its own right, influencing both the crimes and the investigation. The uniformity of the neighborhoods, the predictability of routines, the absence of constant surveillance, these were not just incidental details, but conditions that could be observed, studied, and ultimately exploited. This realization did not place blame on the communities, but it did highlight the ways in which certain environments can create opportunities when combined with the presence of someone willing to take advantage of them. It added another layer to the case, one that extended beyond the individual and into the broader context in which he operated. For the families directly affected, the passage of time brought a different kind of complexity. There was no single path forward, no universal way to process what had happened or to integrate it into the years that followed. Some found ways to rebuild, to create lives that, while forever marked by the past, were not defined entirely by it. Others carried the weight more visibly, their experiences shaping their perspectives in ways that could not be easily set aside. In both cases, the absence of resolution remained a constant, a space where answers should have been but were not. It was not just the lack of a name or a face, but the lack of a moment where everything could be brought into the open, examined, and acknowledged in a way that felt complete. The broader public, too, engaged with the case in ways that shifted over time. Initially, it was a source of immediate concern, something that influenced behavior and dominated conversation. As the years passed, it became part of a larger narrative, one of many cases that captured attention and then receded into the background. But unlike others, it never fully disappeared. It resurfaced periodically, prompted by anniversaries, by new developments in forensic technology, by renewed investigative efforts that hinted at the possibility of progress. Each time, it brought with it a mixture of familiarity and unease, a recognition that the story was both known and unresolved. There is a particular tension in cases that remain open for decades. On one hand, time can be an ally, providing new tools, new perspectives, new opportunities for discovery. On the other, it can be an obstacle, eroding evidence, altering memories, distancing the present from the past in ways that make reconstruction more difficult. The Mr. Cruel case exists within that tension, shaped by both the possibilities and the limitations that time introduces. Investigators must navigate not only the original challenges, but also the changes that have occurred since, adapting their approaches while remaining grounded in the details that have not changed. The question of identity continues to hover at the center of everything, not just as a practical goal for the investigation, but as a conceptual anchor for understanding the case. Who was he, beyond the actions that defined him? What circumstances, experiences, or internal factors contributed to the behavior that has been studied for so long? These questions do not excuse or justify, but they do form part of the broader effort to comprehend, to place the events within a framework that can be analyzed and, perhaps, learned from. They are questions that extend beyond this single case, touching on the nature of certain types of criminal behavior and the ways in which it can manifest within otherwise ordinary settings. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all questions will be answered, at least not immediately. The expectation of complete understanding, of a narrative that resolves every uncertainty, is often challenged by reality. In this case, that challenge is particularly pronounced, given the lack of definitive evidence and the careful measures taken by the offender to avoid identification. It requires a willingness to accept partial knowledge, to work with what is available while remaining open to what might still emerge. And yet, despite all of this, the case endures. It endures in the work that continues behind the scenes, in the files that are revisited, in the discussions that take place among those who remain committed to finding answers. It endures in the memories of those who were directly affected, in the ways they carry their experiences forward, shaping their lives in ways both visible and unseen. It endures in the broader understanding of how such crimes can occur, influencing how similar cases are approached, how communities think about safety, how investigators prepare for challenges that may not yet have fully revealed themselves. There is no final resolution here, no moment where everything comes together in a way that provides complete closure. Instead, there is a continuation, a steady, ongoing presence that resists being confined to the past. It is a reminder that some stories do not end in the way we expect, that some questions remain open not because they are unimportant, but because they are difficult, complex, and, in some cases, deliberately obscured. And so, the case remains what it has been for so many years, a search without a final answer, a narrative defined as much by what is unknown as by what is known, a reflection of both the capabilities and the limitations of those who seek to understand it. In the end, what remains is not a single image or a final revelation, but a collection of moments that refuse to settle into silence. The story does not close itself, it lingers, reshaping the way it is remembered each time it is told. In the quiet streets of Melbourne, the passage of time has layered new lives over old memories, yet beneath those layers, there is still something intact, something that belongs not to the present, but to a series of nights that changed everything in ways no one could have anticipated. It is not visible in the way a physical mark might be, but it exists in the way people pause, in the way they listen, in the way they consider the boundaries between what is safe and what only feels safe. The name that once dominated headlines has become quieter now, spoken less often, but not forgotten. It has moved from urgency to reflection, from immediate fear to a more distant, enduring awareness. And in that transition, it has taken on a different kind of meaning. It is no longer just a reference to a sequence of crimes, but a symbol of something broader, something that extends beyond the specifics of time and place. It represents the idea that control can be exercised without chaos, that harm can be inflicted without noise, that someone can move through the most ordinary environments while carrying something deeply concealed. For those who return to this case, whether as investigators, analysts, or storytellers, there is a recurring realization that the absence of an ending does not diminish the significance of what has been uncovered. If anything, it amplifies it. Each detail that has been preserved, each pattern that has been recognized, contributes to a body of understanding that exists even without a final conclusion. It is a form of knowledge that is incomplete, but not without value, a map that shows where answers have been sought, even if it does not yet reveal where they ultimately lie. Within Victoria Police, the case continues to occupy a space that is both historical and active. It is not approached with the expectation of an easy breakthrough, but with the recognition that persistence itself is part of the process. New technologies emerge, new methodologies are developed, and with each advancement, there is a renewed possibility that something once hidden might be brought into view. This does not guarantee resolution, but it ensures that the search does not stagnate, that the effort remains ongoing rather than static. There is also a shift that occurs in how such cases are understood over time. Early on, the focus is often on the immediate facts, the sequence of events, the urgent need to identify and apprehend. As time passes, the perspective broadens. The case becomes a point of study, a way to examine not only what happened, but how it happened, why it unfolded in the way it did, and what it reveals about the intersection between individual behavior and environmental context. This shift does not replace the original goals of the investigation, but it adds another layer, one that contributes to a deeper, more nuanced understanding. For the victims, and for those connected to them, this broader perspective does not change the core reality of their experiences. The passage of time may alter the intensity of certain emotions, may create distance from the immediacy of what occurred, but it does not erase it. The memories remain, sometimes sharp, sometimes softened, but always present in some form. The lack of a definitive conclusion means that there is no single moment where everything is resolved, no point at which the past can be fully separated from the present. Instead, there is an ongoing process of integration, of finding ways to live with what cannot be changed while continuing to move forward. The community, too, carries its own version of that process. The initial shock has long since passed, replaced by a quieter awareness that surfaces in subtle ways. It is present in conversations about safety, in the way certain precautions become normalized, in the understanding that even the most familiar environments can hold unexpected risks. This awareness does not dominate daily life, but it becomes part of it, a background element that shapes perception without necessarily defining it. There is a temptation, when faced with an unresolved case, to search for a final statement, a definitive message that can bring everything together. But the truth is more complex than that. Not all stories provide closure, and not all questions receive answers within the time frame we expect. In some cases, the significance lies not in the resolution, but in the persistence of the search, in the refusal to let uncertainty become indifference. That persistence is, in itself, a form of acknowledgement. It acknowledges that what happened matters, that the people affected are not forgotten, that the effort to understand and to seek accountability continues even when the path forward is unclear. It is a commitment that exists without guarantees, sustained by the belief that answers, however delayed, are still worth pursuing. And so, the story remains open. Not incomplete in the sense of lacking meaning, but unfinished in the sense that its final chapter has yet to be written. It exists in a space between what is known and what is still hidden, shaped by both the details that have been uncovered and the questions that remain unanswered. Somewhere, beyond the reach of current understanding, there is a version of this story that is whole, that contains every detail, every connection, every piece of information needed to bring it to a close. Whether that version will ever be fully revealed is uncertain. But the fact that it exists, that it is possible, is enough to keep the search alive. Because stories like this do not end simply because time passes. They endure. In memory, in investigation, in the quiet determination of those who continue to ask the same question that has guided everything from the beginning. Who was he? And until that question is answered, the silence that surrounds it is not an ending, but a pause, one that holds within it the possibility, however distant, that one day, the truth will finally step out of the shadows and into the light.